Wow. I almost want to say, woke up, got out of bed, dragged a comb across my head. Hello, everybody. I'm Justin Vogt, Executive Editor of Foreign Affairs. Welcome to our plenary session today here at the Halifax Security Forum. We have a great panel, really interesting group of people. We're going to get to them in just a second. First, I do want to just remind everybody that mask wearing is mandatory. Please keep masks on. I've been actually very impressed by this, by watching people's compliance with this. It's a very confusing time. We're going to talk about that. You know, mask on, mask off, handshake, fist bump, elbow bump, you know, ritual dance. We all don't know what we're doing, but I've been very impressed by everyone, the level of care I've seen here. So thank you all. Our panelists are an interesting and diverse group. I'm not going to bore you with their bios. You have them. You know who they are. We have a Ghanaian entrepreneur, a U.S. senator, and the president of Kosovo have walked into our proverbial bar, and we're going to try to tease out some thoughts from them today. What I'd like to begin with is, you know, I'm an editor, and so my job is to cut, and try to simplify everything. This topic we've been given is very, very large, and you know, the question of a post-pandemic world, we're not there yet, obviously, and we want to get there. What I'm going to ask each of our panelists to begin with, and I'm going to start with you, Madam President, is to ask a very simple question. It's deceptively simple. There are a million things that have to happen for us to reach this post-pandemic world. If it were in your power to do it, what would be the single thing, the one thing that you would like to see happen? And specifically, who has to do that, right? So let's put aside something must be done or this has to happen. Who specifically needs to do what, precisely in your view, the single most important thing on a very long list?
Well, let me first say how happy I am to be among all of you today. Thank you so much for having me at this important forum, which brings together people from around the world to speak about what truly matters in the world today. It's so hard to pick one. The pandemic has been so harsh, so hard on each and every one of us, no matter how big or small the countries are, which means that to recover, we need to do a lot of things. But perhaps inspired by the video, I would say, let's make sure that lessons learned are not lessons forgotten. It has happened so many times in our history. And one really important lesson that we all learned, especially those of us that are small countries, is that there is power in partnership. In a complex world with so many complex problems that became even more complex with the pandemic, we need to understand that partnerships working together are the key to resolving problems. Because unless we do, obviously, we're going to deal with so many other pandemics, with so many international crises, with so many humanitarian crises in the future. We are doomed to fail, or we are obviously going to see very little success. And secondly, if we don't understand that there is power in partnership, then we're letting autocrats become much more successful than they were so far. The pandemic has shown how countries like Russia and China have abused that very difficult situation and have abused the so-called vaccine diplomacy to actually extort malign influence upon countries. And while they were doing that, the so-called vaccine diplomacy, at the same time, simultaneously, they were also using disinformation. And through disinformation, they were making sure that their malign influence also becomes malicious. Malicious because it kills people, because the result was killing people. And of course, this kind of malicious influence, this kind of malign influence as well, will be much more successful if we don't truly understand that our power lies in the partnerships that we have. Our power lies in the values that we each represent. Our power lies in us working together to defend and protect what we've achieved in the past centuries, which is fundamentals first, values first, human rights, democracy, rule of law. So democratic countries working together to make sure that we build a more resilient society in each and every country that we represent is key to making sure that the recovery will be successful as well. Otherwise, I think if anyone believes that we can do this alone, no matter how big or small, it means that, lessons learned were actually lessons forgotten.
Got it. So to distill, your answer is democratic governments have to work together. And specifically, I liked what you talked about in combating disinformation, the weaponization of disinformation on the part of autocracies. Great.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Senator, the one thing.
Okay, well, first of all, I want to thank Peter and the producers for reminding us about our great tradition of the orderly transfer of power. That's the way you began the film segment, and I know you were making a statement about that. I also want to thank you for giving us the opportunity to follow Lady Gaga. And also for scheduling us after lunch. And I noticed even this morning a number of our delegates who had traveled along while they had seemingly closed their eyes in silent prayer, even in the morning. So I will not be offended. I wore some nice bright socks to keep you awake. If I could wave a magic wand, I would do a game changer that would move us from purely vaccines to a therapeutic cure of COVID-19. And as a matter of fact, I wouldn't have to do it because we have two therapeutics, one from Merck and one from Pfizer, that are there just about to be approved. Within the next 10 days to 2 weeks, the FDA will approve the Pfizer drug and the Merck drug. The tests were the protocols were so successful that they were ended early because, according to science, it's unethical to give a placebo to someone when it's already self-evident that the drug works. So I would wave my magic wand and make happen what is about to happen in 10 days to 2 weeks, and then that would be FDA. I would imagine that WHO will quickly approve these therapeutics, and that will indeed be the game changer.
All right.
Dustin.
Right. Yeah.
So, like everyone else, I also want to re-echo my very deep appreciation to the forum for this invitation, making sure that, and I looked through the program, Africa's interests are well represented. I think we are moving to a world where the marginalization of certain parts of the world is going to be history. So this is very encouraging to see. To answer your question directly, I will be as concrete as the first two speakers have been and say that we have to look at the greatest mismatch in the world today. And that greatest mismatch is that individuals have stashed $9 trillion in tax savings that are attracting zero, in some instances, negative return. Nearly negative interest rate all across the world in tax savings. If you add corporations, you're hitting close to 40 trillion. Now, it costs just $100 billion to move the entire Africa into a high-speed internet age. So the mismatch of money not making any return in different parts of the world and the incredible transformation that is possible in many parts of the world with just a little amount of capital tells us that we can build a brand new world with better infrastructure, better healthcare systems that are more resilient even in the face of the greatest shocks we've ever seen, etc., etc., etc. If we can only find a matching mechanism. But that matching mechanism is not a global minimal tax. That is actually a very ridiculous idea. I'm not going to go into that. But generally, if people have money sitting somewhere that is not making a profit or a return, and there are other people that could make a return of 20%. If you invested in the internet tech economy in Africa today, you probably make about 20% per annum annual return. Now, it's a no-brainer that matching that source of capital to the opportunity is the biggest opportunity we have to transform the world. And you ask, who should do that? And here is where, of course, in the course of the conversation, I intend to elaborate a bit more. I think the formal multilateral institutions, the UN and the rest, are generally not as well suited to the opportunities that we have in the world now. And those that, in a way, get disappointed by the current pace and scope of globalization because these multilateral institutions are not doing too well, underestimate the powerful underbrush of informal, private international law type institutions like the International Chamber of Commerce and others representing global business that, to my mind, because of things like the Incoterms, things like model contracts, are actually responsible for a bigger chunk of the outturn on globalization than most people realize. It's not the World Bank, it's not the IMF, it's really international organizations that are largely private, largely informal, but hugely influential when it comes to developing new problem-solving norms. And I think these are the ones that we need to invest more in.
I want to stick with you for just 1 second, because it's an interesting answer. It's a surprising answer, and I want to try to get it a little more concrete, which is to this question of, let's say you did that. Let's say you could wave that magic wand and get all that capital sitting there that's not, that untapped potential. With COVID specifically, explain to me, how would that help, actually?
So we know that the cost of a vaccine is not that much, right? AstraZeneca and the rest had to be prodded to make these global public goods. Yes, only 6% of Africans are vaccinated. A huge chunk of that is due to the current global architecture of the value chains. And you cannot solve that by simply imposing some kind of pandemic treaty, which is what the former multilateral system is currently pushing. The idea that some kind of global hard law will be transformed. It won't. You need to invest in Africa, Asia, the Middle East's ability to connect to global value chains. Much of that is infrastructure driven. So to give you an example, shipping lines within Africa, it's cheaper to ship from Hong Kong to an African country than it is to ship from one African country to another. It's cheaper very often to fly through Paris from, let's say, Cote d'Ivoire through Paris to Congo than to fly directly. None of that makes any sense. But a lot of that is infrastructural bottlenecks due to underinvestment. Now, if you were to invest properly in global chain related infrastructure, a lot of the problems that are vaccine related, for instance, wouldn't occur. The problems are not necessarily because somebody's sitting there saying Africa is not going to get vaccinated. We don't like these Africans, right? It's due to the lack of integration of Africa into global value chains. And that can be solved with infrastructural investment and other types of investments.
Okay, so unlocking that capital would produce all kinds of downstream effects that would help with a situation like this. Okay, understood. Senator, I want to just go back to your point about prevention and therapeutics. I know this is something you've talked a lot about. What may, aside from the idea that these things are going to come online and become very helpful, why is this do you see this as a kind of either or?
Oh, it's not. No.
Okay.
No,
we'll elaborate for me. Maybe you could tell me a little bit about the history.
Therapeutics are the game changer, though.
Okay.
No one who has taken these two types of therapeutics has ever died of COVID-19. No one. You might still suffer from the disease for a day or two, as I did when I had it earlier this year. But no one has ever passed away because of COVID-19 if they've taken the Merck or the Pfizer drug. When we went 20 years ago, when the United States led the way with PEPFAR, I remember there was a statement that maybe Peter made at the beginning of this weekend that Nigeria is expected to have a population explosion and be 400 million people in a short period of time. Back then, that's not what people were saying about Africa. When AIDS we started hearing about AIDS in the early 80s and the mid 80s, it was going to devastate the population of Africa. We could lose 30, 40% of all Africans. That's what we were looking at. And then the genius of science and collaboration, as Madam President mentioned, came forward. And it was mainly, the PEPFAR program was mainly therapeutics for AIDS. Now, there was some prevention, condoms, circumcision advocated by a number of people and adopted more in some countries than others in terms of prevention. But we never got to a reliable vaccine. It was the therapeutic drug that was the game changer. And you know, we've got some people who, for whatever reason, are reluctant to take the vaccine. And I don't know, there's a certain type of human being who, if told you have to do something, that makes them all the more eager just not to do it. And so we're going to have people that refuse to take the vaccine. But if you've got the disease and there are two therapeutic drugs to choose from, I can't imagine someone who's feeling pretty bad turning that down. And that's the reason I think that is much better news, even than the great vaccines that resulted from international efforts, including Operation Warp Speed.
Okay, we're going to get, I want to drill down a little bit on some of these questions about vaccine hesitancy and state power and mandates, and we're going to get to that in a second. And in fact, it's an interesting segue for the question I want to ask you, Madam President. Just in the past week, you've had some pretty good news, actually, relatively good news. What good news means these days is a little open to interpretation. But can you talk a little bit about the recent experience and what you think Kosovo has been doing right, and whether you feel optimistic about those gains persisting?
Sure. Perhaps to start by saying that when the pandemic hit us back in March 2020, just like the rest of the world, we had no playbook. So practically it was like trying to fix the plane while it was mid-air, while it was flying. But no one had any rules. So playing real time, acting real time became the norm during the first couple of months, I would say, which is when we had a complete lockdown. Back then, as well as now, we have found out that there is one common denominator to success, and that is trust of the people in the institutions. Whether it was at the beginning about the lockdown and closing the economy and everything, or now when it comes to vaccines, making sure that you effectively fight disinformation, no matter how much money is spent, no matter who are the countries that are spending that money to spread disinformation, and making sure that the trust in the institutions remains strong has been, I believe, the success to this process. Right now, obviously our numbers are lower. That doesn't mean that it's going to remain that way. Unfortunately, what we see around Europe, Germany, the United Kingdom, and the rest of these countries that are quite close to us geographically is that numbers are really increasing. But right now we have around 6 cases per million, which is
quite low relative to...
Quite low compared to the rest of Europe and perhaps many countries around the world. And we have the highest number of vaccinations in the region and higher than in many countries within the European Union. However, to get to here, we really needed help. We needed help from partners. We're the last country in Europe to even start with vaccination because we're the only country in the region to say no to Russian and Chinese vaccines. We had only resorted, obviously it was a risky decision, but for us, making sure that we fight these malign influences even during the most difficult times was crucial to our success. So we said only yes to FDA approved and to EMA, European approved vaccination, and obviously anything else that will come in the meantime.
It's coming.
For that reason, that has also helped increase the trust of our citizens who are as I often say, the most pro-European, most pro-American, obviously the most pro-Canadian as well, nation on earth. And bringing vaccines that are embraced, that are accepted by the nations who have been there for us during the difficult times, as well as the bright days, has really helped increase the level of trust of the people in the vaccination. So right now, with a little bit of a measures, with people really trusting that when the institutions want to introduce measures, that is for their benefit, it is for their health, it is, of course, in the benefit of the rest of the world as well, because no matter how small the country, we've noticed that it can play a big role in, infecting others if you're not doing well with vaccination. We have a very large diaspora. We have one of the biggest international community presences in the region. So they travel back and forth. The people of Kosovo travel back and forth, which means that if we're not successful in vaccination, obviously the virus is either going to come or it's going to leave our country. During the most difficult times, when it was hard to, as a small country, you're a very little market, it's so hard to convince the big companies. Eventually, we were successful in that, but in purchasing from Pfizer directly. But we had to reach out to our friends, primarily to the United States of America. We needed vaccines, and we got a positive response immediately. We got 500,000 vaccines from the United States. We got support from members of the European Union. And two very important points, we got help from other countries in the region. So, neighbors were really helping one another, even if they had difficulties within their country. They were sharing that little amount that they had with other countries in the region. And finally, what we saw was the small country to small country solidarity, which was really good to see, like countries like Malta, for example, helping Kosovo. And obviously, we have been extremely engaged in working with the rest of the world to make sure that our region gets enough supplies. So we were never asking for help only for ourselves, but also for our friends, for other countries in the region, knowing how important beating COVID-19 globally was. So right now, as I said, we're doing pretty well. Our lessons are, work together with your friends, make sure that there is trust in the institution so that the people can get vaccinated on time, and then they can also respect the measures, no matter how strict they are. But at the same time, we have to recognize we haven't beaten the pandemic yet. So we don't really know what's coming in the future. We have to be prepared even for a new, much bigger wave, which is why it is important to prevent. But while we move on from prevention to recovery, we need to understand that, as it is with climate change, the same with COVID-19, there's no country that is skipped. It doesn't skip a country. There's no particular part of the world, no matter how rich or poor, that is going to be skipped. And of course, the same with climate change, as I mentioned, because I think the pandemic has shown the very close connection of human with the nature, to understand that when we speak with climate change, we're actually talking about our own health. We're talking about our kids, we're talking about our homes, and we're talking about the place where we will be living. So there's a really close connection between the both.
You talk about building trust, and I'm curious, actually, was there a lot of pushback in Kosovo with state mandate measures, lockdowns, things like that? And how did you deal with that?
There wasn't at the beginning. At the beginning, it was probably the most amazing place on earth in terms of how much the citizens really wanted to obey all of the rules, despite of the fact that we had a complete lockdown at the very beginning. Full respect for all of the measures. But then when the disinformation campaigns hit the region, mostly funded by Russia, this is when we started to see, actually that succeeding to a certain extent. Despite of that, I think in terms of vaccine hesitancy, we have the lowest in the region yet. It doesn't mean that we should be happy. So far, around 64% of the population, those who were eligible, were vaccinated. But as we can see in countries like Germany, who has, I think, a similar figure of vaccination, that is not enough.
Right.
You can get another wave, which obviously mostly hits those who are unvaccinated, but also sometimes those who are vaccinated, although they get away much easier from the situation.
We've seen what happened in Austria. Austria has now announced that they're going to mandate vaccines for all, essentially. Is that the kind of step that Kosovo would consider if things got better?
I'm very much in favor of it. I'm very much in favor of it because, first of all, as I said, the hesitancy is not that high. Secondly, I think just going back to history and the kind of vaccines that we had to take at schools when we were little, and all of the from measles to the other diseases that we had to fight in previous centuries and decades, it shows that a vaccine mandate is actually what will beat the virus. Whether now science is going to come up with much better solutions, obviously I'm not the expert here, and if they come up with better solutions like taking a pill, which is what we hear nowadays, or other kind of measures, it's going to make things much easier. But I think the vaccine mandate is what's going to help, whether we're going to connect it. Look, in Kosovo, we have the best macchiato in the world. And I know Italians will not believe that, but it is true. I invite you all to come and see, beyond the rest of the country, which is really beautiful, and the very welcoming people. But we were talking today about how it would be wise if, whoever goes for a macchiato, one of the most popular cultures in our country, should really, be mandated to have the vaccination, and that's going to do the magic.
So you get a shot and a double shot.
If you can't have, exactly, a double shot. If you can't have your macchiato without the vaccination, that's really going to increase the numbers of those who are vaccinated.
It's a kind of mandate, I guess, is what you're saying, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Madam President, he was speaking about kind of this sense that the pandemic doesn't skip anywhere. Beforehand, in agreement, we were talking a little bit about some of the countries in Africa where you spend time, where you told me that your sense was almost as if people were living in some parts of those countries as if there really was no pandemic at this point. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think a lot of people in the audience here haven't seen that firsthand. There are places that almost seem post-pandemic already, although perhaps the real question is whether they're just pre-pandemic. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, there are many countries in Africa where there were no lockdowns. Countries like Niger, Mali. Some of them because they are sparsely populated, not very connected to international travel lines and links. So we do have some really fascinating situations where you walk into some African countries and you can't believe there's a global pandemic at all. In the individual countries like Ghana, Senegal, Kenya, South Africa, where you did have a significant surge in numbers, it tended to also have this fascinating rural-urban dichotomy, where in the urban areas, particularly in the elite communities, the same panic that was happening in Europe, in Italy, and elsewhere was evident. But you go into the rural areas, you go into certain parts of the urban clusters, and you can't feel there's a pandemic at all. Some people have hypothesized that perhaps there's something to do with people that live primarily outdoors or are constantly out on the streets and don't have significant accumulation of the particles, and therefore they are less likely to be infected. We don't know for sure. And the science is now all over the place. But the truth is, you are right. There are places in Africa where none of these global concerns have been very evident on the ground at all.
But let's say that President Ousmane is right, and it's just a matter of time before it reaches those places. How confident are you that a place like Ghana is going to be prepared?
Yes, Ghana has had 2 waves, small waves, one around June of last year, and then the other around December, and I personally was ill for many months. So it's not like they've not seen it at all. It's just that you're talking of a country of 30 million and a couple of big cities, and you only feel this in 3 cities. That was the Ghana experience. And for the vast majority of people in the rural areas and the rest of it, well, people have talked about undercounting. So there is a very detailed study around the fact that given the nature of the disease, if people die from breathlessness, it's easy to detect. But there are other symptoms that are not as obvious. And therefore, we could have had a significant source of undercounting in Africa.
Didn't know.
That's possible.
Yeah. Senator Worker, I want to return a little bit to the theme that President Ousmane Sadri was talking about in terms of state, and you were getting at it earlier. Austria has a vaccine mandate now. We've heard the president of Kosovo say that she would support such a thing. In the U.S. Context, you've been fairly firmly opposed to the idea of vaccine mandates.
Oh, yes.
And also, I think, mask mandates as well, right? So I guess I want to ask you, my question for you is sort of simple and philosophical, which is, if you're opposed to mask mandates and you're opposed to vaccine mandates, and we're in the middle of a pandemic where 750,000 or so, 700,000 Americans almost have died, what is an example of an action that you would consider legitimate for a government to take to compel citizens to either do something or not do something? Is there anything that a government authority can do in this kind of public health crisis that you think would be a legitimate use of that power?
Well, as a matter of fact, I don't know that I've spoken out against mask mandates. I've been particularly vocal about treating churches differently from other establishments. Under our Constitution, the First Amendment to our Constitution, churches are special, and it made no sense to me. And I got a amicus brief in the U.S. Senate to the district court in the District of Columbia, where the mayor was requiring masks in church, and frankly, prohibiting churches from meeting when other bars and places like that
it seemed to be the standard,
could be open. But I would leave it up. I would leave the mask issue up to the states and the mayors. We believe in federalism, and it may be that the people of Massachusetts or Delaware feel differently, or their elected officials feel differently. I could say, down in Mississippi, we're much more like the politics of Florida, where Governor DeSantis has been pretty vocal there. I don't know that you see a difference in the incidence of COVID, but between these southern states that are more averse to a mask and in states in other parts of the country. But I think what the president just pointed out, it just shows the difference of constituencies. I can tell you, and I think all 6 of our American senators that are here for this conference would tell you that a vaccine mandate in the United States of America would not be well received by vast portion of the population. There's a mandate ordered by the President of the United States that has been to businesses that are 100 employees.
Right, 100 employees or more.
Or more. That has been stopped for the moment by a circuit court, and it will go to the Supreme Court. But I don't think, for one thing, anybody ever gave the president, who has police powers and can declare martial law, I don't think anyone has ever given the president the power to mandate a vaccine. But also, I think there are real constitutional problems with that. And I just don't think that could happen in the United States, because I think so many of our citizens would object to that it would be unenforceable.
Okay, understood. I'd like to open things up to our audience, to who may want to ask some questions. I'm going to go with the sort of precedent that Robin seemed to have set of going to doing female and male alternating if we can. So I'm going to encourage everybody. I'm going to ask.
Is that fair in 2021?
In 2021. Well, I'm sorry. What do you mean?
To single out people because of their gender.
Well, I'm trying to make for an inclusive Q&A session, but I'll do my best to try to get as many different people as I can. Okay, let's start with the woman who has her hand up here. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, Madam President, Senator, thank you very much. Jude Terry from the Royal Navy and a Peace with Women Fellow of this year. I'd like to ask a question about heeding globalization. So the title is Heal and Heeding Globalization. The description that we have all given of every democratic country and non-democratic country and how they dealt with the pandemic would suggest that every country is very different, despite the fact that we all have democracy in everyone here is representing democracies in different forms. How do we take that forward in terms of developing a strategy and the alliances that we've heard over the last 2 days? Because if we try and do one size fits all, whether it's for a pandemic, whether it's for China, whether it's for Russia, we're going to come unstuck. And that's when the autocrats are able to get involved in misinformation, disinformation, and all those other things, because they exploit our differences because we haven't necessarily acknowledged them. And I'd be really interested in either using the COVID pandemic as an example or your own comments on globalization as we go forward. Thank you.
Well, I think you do it with diplomacy and conciliation, and you come to an agreement to the extent you can, and it may very well be that with regard to research going forward, there may be some international agreements about the safety of labs. Inspection of labs by an international group, for example, and whether those inspections should be unannounced or scheduled, much as we do with other very serious things like nuclear weapons. So, but that it would then be up to the various nation states to decide whether or not to be part of that. But you do it through diplomacy and discussion, just like other difficult issues.
And I think it also happens by really recognizing those differences. Just because, you know, countries are different in terms of, you know, their culture, their heritage, their past, doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have the best intentions for their people. So I think through diplomacy, through increasing contacts, through helping one another, it will be possible to make sure that the number of countries that get together on finding the solutions to all of the problems that you've mentioned, plus many more that we're dealing with in this world, will be easier to find. And at the same time, I think the bigger the number of countries who will then increase their voice in not appeasing autocracies, but actually using direct language and action towards autocracies and dictators around the world, the better. Because I think the pandemic and lots of the problems that we're seeing around the world have also increased the level of appeasement, if I may say so, against autocrats, which I think always encourages them. Instead of encouraging democracies, it encourages the increased level of autocratic regimes and their numbers as well. I mean, just to mention an example on how the pandemic has been abused in our very small region of the world. Russia was, of course, sending quite a lot of Russian vaccines to Serbia. Serbia is interested to fight Kosovo's independence. Many countries in Africa had no vaccines. So Serbia was using Russian vaccines to send bunches of them to countries in Africa and tell them, I'm going to give you vaccines if you de-recognize Kosovo.
Right.
So
did it work? Did it work at all?
Well, they say that it worked. We still don't have, announcements from any of these countries in Africa that they are de-recognizing Kosovo, but it was absolutely tried. Mm-hmm. And it was making countries like Russia and Serbia, two absolutely autocratic regimes, look good. Because many other countries that really needed to help some of the African nations and some of the countries in Asia as well, were still, of course, grappling to get enough vaccines for themselves. So I think the more we understand that while we're trying, of course, to work internally with the problems that we have, we don't turn our attention away from the rest of the world, but help from the beginning, help when is actually needed, the more our words will be taken seriously when we sit down and try to reach the agreements that we need internationally, well, whether it's about preventing future pandemics or dealing with climate change and other big problems that we're facing.
Thank you. You want to jump into that?
Yeah, absolutely.
I can see you scribbling there, yeah, so I know you had some thoughts.
Yeah, the question around one size fits all, I think, is profound, and it's at this very center of the debate on globalization. There are two types of international action, broadly speaking. Those that foster integration and those that foster proliferation. So great ideas will proliferate. Doesn't mean that we have to integrate. By sheer ability to solve specific problems, they proliferate. And I think when it comes to international actions that foster integration, the one-size-fits-all type international actions, they are best when they are binding. So like the 1815 Vienna Declaration or the 1841 London Treaty that banned the international slavery trade in Africa, as an example, or the Montreal Protocol in the 80s that banned CFCs. Global action of that nature tend to be very simple, effective, straightforward, and they're very effective. When it comes to global action to do things, they're not too effective. And there, I think, when we have to look at more private international law type regimes, and what I describe it as the underbrush of international action. I think what the pandemic is going to do is refocus our attention back to genomics and genetic research for two reasons. Every time we have a crisis, there is a boost in particular types of technologies. And as a technologist, this is of obvious interest. Radar and radio in the Second World War, as an example. This pandemic is the pandemic of genetic and genomics research. Remember that in 1918, when we had the Spanish flu, you could not detect who was asymptomatic infected and symptomatic infected because we couldn't have a general purpose diagnostic like PCR, where you can literally take your blood sample and look for genetic fingerprints of different pathogens. Now we do. And it's boosting genomics research in amazing ways. Variants, for instance. Now, variants, trying to detect mutants of the pathogen that can cause more harm, is one of the biggest boosters of genomic research going forward. We may need some international moratoria or bans on certain types of genomics research in more explicit terms because of the fear around force of function and other types of research, which people think may have led to this pandemic. Of course, there's no complete proof, but there's fears that engineering a kind of synthetic weapon, particularly in the biological domain, is one of the biggest nightmare scenarios we have. So that is one of those type of areas where a global moratorium is simple enough, verification will be hard, but at least we do that in nuclear proliferation. So why not in the proliferation of biological weapons, for instance? When it comes to things to do on that hand,
it's hard.
I'm not too convinced that global action of the multilateral form is the best.
Senator Wick, I want to give I wonder whether you want to do a little two-finger on this, because I know that this type of research that he's talking about is something you've spoken about and are interested in doing legislation on. Do you want to weigh in on that issue before we take another question?
Mr. Simons talks, he doesn't use the term, but I think you're talking about what some people call a gain of function research. And that is a term that is somewhat misused and misunderstood, but basically it means the manipulation of a virus in a lab to become different. And there has been at least one scholarly study that concluded that it was highly possible that that COVID-19 was the result of this type of gain of function research. Several years ago, the international community took a 3-year pause on gain of function research, and then it was re-implemented. I've signed legislation based on what we know now and what we'd like to know, and the studies, one of which I mentioned, to implement another moratorium, at least a moratorium on American taxpayer dollars going to fund gain of function research. You'll hear different viewpoints from very learned, scholarly researchers.
Because there's trade-offs.
About that.
There are trade-offs involved, right, yeah. Okay, let's get our next question. This gentleman here with his hand up, with the white mask.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm Mauricio Mechulam from the Mexico Research Center for Peace. I think, Madam President, you brought a very important point, which is trust in institutions. How do you build trust in institutions? How have you done it, and have you been successful? Because it is a global issue. If you take a look at the Edelman barometer for trust, 3/4 of the human population have distrust in their institutions. What would be your recommendations to that?
Oh, probably in the case of Kosovo, I would say consistency. If as a politician you stay consistent in your positions and for quite a long time, if you truly convince the people that you care about them, then there comes a time where they will reward you with their trust, which is the most important thing in politics. And I've been in politics for the past 20 years because I started really young. And it is because of what I've done in these 20 years and what my colleagues have done in these 20 years, what the current government have done when we were in opposition, when we were in different positions, that we've managed to have the trust that we have today. We weren't lucky because the very first days that we took over the institutions, the pandemic started and so on. So very big challenges from the very beginning, and even bigger challenges in our region than in many places around the world. It's not just the pandemic, where every day we're in the danger of aggression from autocratic regimes. Russia is extremely interested to destabilize our part of the world because with that, they want to obviously undo everything that the West, everything that the United States, the European Union, and NATO have achieved in the Western Balkans. So for them, it's not just, little Kosovo. For them, it's, Western democracies versus the Russian autocracy. That's why they are so interested to destabilize our part of the world and make sure that through their trampoline, which is Serbia, they wage new wars. So obviously the number of challenges is immense, but honestly, we've achieved the trust not during the past couple of months or in the past couple of years. It's been 2 decades in our case of hard work to convince the people that you're there for them, and so that they can entrust you not just with their future, but in the case of the pandemic, with their health, with their well-being, which obviously has found so many of the countries around the world grappling with how to really convince the people to trust you their health. That has been our case. Obviously, that doesn't mean that once you get that very high level of trust, because the current institutions got the highest number of votes in the history of the country, doesn't mean that if you don't work hard, you can keep it that way. So obviously, it's a very big challenge to keep that level of trust. But I think, my advice to, at least to Kosovo politicians, obviously I don't tend to give advice to the rest, but
It's okay, you're
is, grassroots politics, work with the people, talk to them every single day. The pandemic made that really hard. Be with them. Don't spend all of your time in the office. Go to their houses, talk to them about how important this is.
If I could jump in.
Please.
For one thing, a healthy skepticism of political leaders is probably universal and good. What was this exact statistic you gave about what percentage of the world's population?
It's called the Edelman Trust Barometer, and it is a yearly measure of different institutions' trust, and it says that we're in leadership crisis and mistrust of mass media.
So an across the board decrease.
So,
in institutional
okay. Well, I would just say, with regard to governments, though, we have a massive global problem with corruption, and it's not getting any better. And something that we talk about in the OSCE, which I'm a member of their parliamentary assembly, United States and Canada, and many of these other nations participate in that. But corruption is getting worse. And to the extent that it is there, the public knows it's there. And I would say it is one of the main reasons for distrust of government.
I agree.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to go for another question. Let's have the gentleman with his hand up here wearing a black mask.
Good afternoon, Tolu Ogunlesi from Nigeria. I just wanted to hear the thoughts of the panel on, I think, how much we have allowed the fact we've not paid attention to some of the upsides, I think, of the pandemic in places like Africa. So Nigeria went into the pandemic in 2020 with about 5 molecular labs, just 5. Today there is 150 plus, and so those kind of things I'm not seeing. And I want to hear what you think about how we've overlooked a lot of that stuff, about the positive ways in which the pandemic has been sort of a shot in the arm, to healthcare systems in parts of the world that need the biggest boosts in healthcare.
That's a good way. That'd be a good way to close. We've got about 3 minutes left. Some silver linings of the pandemic, I guess, is how I would phrase that. You brought up one already, Brad, but maybe you have some others.
Indeed. No, actually, Toyo, I did mention genomics and genetic research as having seen a massive boost because of PCR. Most people now know what a PCR means. I doubt a year ago they did. Virtual conferencing and the secondary uses of virtual conferencing in telemedicine in a whole bunch of areas. Courts are now finally in Africa sitting virtually. What would that mean for access to justice if we could, broaden that? So I think there are huge advances in genomics, huge advances in digital technologies that this pandemic will leave behind. The question is, can we build a supporting infrastructure to proliferate that?
Any other silver linings we should keep in mind, maybe give us a little hope and a little bit more of a positive sense?
I think the pandemic has shown the importance of investing in your health sector, with or without a pandemic, how important that is. I represent a country where we have inherited practically a zero investment in the health system because it was completely destroyed during the war, no investment during the 90s. And then after the war, it was kind of, left aside because we had to rebuild the society and the country. And now we understand that, if we really want to recover, you cannot think about economic development unless you're really investing in your people. And that primarily means investing in your healthcare sector. Secondly, we have seen that countries with a stronger healthcare system have a higher rate of survival. Whether if we're talking about those that went into intensive care and then survived, those that had to be put into the respirator machines, and so on. The stronger your healthcare system, the bigger the survival rate, no matter the percentage of the infections. So I do hope that because of what happened, because of how much we've lost from the pandemic, every single country will understand that investing in your healthcare system means that you're investing. It's not spending, it's actually investment in the future of the country, because through a healthy society you will have a healthy, resilient and sustainable economy as well.
The global community, as it did with AIDS 2 decades ago, mobilized and proved once again that we could come together, work fast and be smart and create significant solutions.
Terrific. On that somewhat optimistic note, I think it's a good place to start. Thank you very much to all three of you.
Thank you.
Please enjoy a short break and refreshments in the mezzanine.